For me, an introduction of Lindsay Sabadosa must include a short story and a personal note. When COVID first hit, I was in the process of moving to Northampton from East Hampton. Every day, I biked in and saw more and more people amassing under the bridge on the bike path. When the smell became too much for me, I called Representative Sabadosa's office. I did not know Representative Sabadosa, and to this day, I'm not sure if Representative Sabadosa really knows me, but I left a message with pretty much what I just said. And Lindsay Sabadosa called me back, not her office, but Lindsay, and asked me about what was happening. I explained to her that I had been biking in, and every day there seemed to be more and more people amassing under the bridge as you come into Northampton. What I said to her was, there's no place for them to use the facilities anymore because the library's closed and all the restaurants are closed. And there's no place for them to put their garbage. So everything is just piling up. A couple of days later, I biked in as I normally did. And there were facilities up, porta potties, garbage bins, and a garbage dumpster. It was that quick for Lindsay Sabadosa, a neighbor, because I now live in Northampton, reacted quickly and made sure that the people of her neighborhood were seen to. That's just a small story among many stories I've heard about Lindsay. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce, without fanfare and reading of bios, Representative Lindsay Sabadosa.
Good afternoon. I have to start off by saying Marcia is far too kind. That only happened through an incredible partnership with the city of Northampton, which brings me to the fact that Mayor Sharrock can't be here today and wanted me to send her regrets, but I see many city councilors sitting in the audience. I know I saw Councilor Perrick here, I see Councilor Maori, Councilor Patrick Clemmer, and Councilor Rothenberg. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States at Federal Hall in New York, the nation's capital at the time. He served for 8 years and was followed by John Adams, who was followed by Thomas Jefferson, who was followed by James Madison, who was followed by James Monroe. Now, this is likely information that you have heard at some point, probably in a US history class. Yet I wonder if you were taught that of these men, only John Adams did not own slaves. In fact, 12 US presidents were slaveholders, 8 of them while they were in office, including 4 of the 5 framers of the US Constitution who would go on to be president. The last former slaveholder elected to the office of president was Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the North in the Civil War, President of the United States from 1869 to 1877. Mary Jenkins Schwartz, a historian at the University of Rhode Island, wrote in her book, The Ties That Bound, an exploration of the relationship between our nation's first ladies and the slaves that they owned, that to ignore the history of early America is to avoid understanding it in all of its complexities. She speaks of visiting Monticello and Mount Vernon, and the way that even now, when the stories of those who surrounded the presidents are starting to come to light, they are still told as if they somehow exist apart. She writes, "I cannot help but wonder, though, how this compartmentalization affects our understanding of who the presidents and the first ladies were, who the enslaved people were, and how slavery shaped the nation from its creation." As we sit here together today, I'm certain that if I went up to each of you and asked you who the most important people are in your lives, you would probably start with the people you lived with. And I would bet that that holds true no matter your profession. So why do we feel that presidents are somehow different? I would posit that they're not. Still, it's a question with which we have historically grappled very little. The United States is a nation that was founded on beautiful ideals of democracy. For generations, the hallmarks of that democracy have become a sort of civil religion, which is not my term, that's all Rousseau, but that entered into the lexicon of social scientists with Robert Bellah, who used it to discuss American democracy. And in defining the term, he wrote, "I conceive of the central tradition of the American civil religion not as a form of national self-worship, but as a subordination of the nation to ethical principles that transcend it in terms of which it should be judged." For the United States, he writes, civil religion has its roots in our founding. To wit, he writes, the words and acts of the founding fathers, especially the first few presidents, shaped the form and tone of the civil religion as it has been maintained ever since. Now, I just have to add, some of you may go home and watch like a football game that's on this afternoon. Like, watch for the civil religion. There's going to be a lot of it. But as you're watching that, if you decide to watch it, ask yourselves, how do we reconcile the civil religion, that which allowed a nation which was polarized and divided in 1787 to join as one, that almost fell apart and tried to come together again in the 1860s, and that, quite frankly, now flirts with the lure of authoritarian overtures? How do we reconcile that with a past that has never lived up to the ideals that it espoused and that it continues to espouse? Do we, as some would quite honestly like, hide from the uncomfortable truths, or do we accept them, and from that truth, seek a more fulsome embodiment of those ideals? It is sometimes convenient, especially in northern states, especially in progressive communities, to brush off these stories from the past as things that happened elsewhere, things we fought against, things that we somehow believe were resolved. The North fought the South to stop slavery. Lincoln freed the slaves. The radical Republicans of the 1860s and 70s passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, ending slavery, giving Black people the right to vote, creating birthright citizenship, crafting the Equal Protection Clause, which is quite honestly my favorite because some of the most beautiful and just cases that our courts have ever decided arise from that. But the picture is just not that simple. The North may have fought the South, but northern states repeatedly rejected giving Blacks the right to vote at the ballot box in state elections, well before the 15th Amendment was passed. Lincoln may have freed the slaves, but if you look at the Emancipation Proclamation, only in states that has seceded, not in the whole country. And the historical record further shows he didn't really believe that Blacks and whites should live together. And despite the anti-slavery sentiment, resentment and racialized hatred toward Black people existed in the North. And that's evidenced by events like the draft riots in New York in July of 1863. That's when a mob destroyed a recruiting station and then marched through the city for 3 days, destroying the homes and businesses of Black people, killing 119. That was neither the first nor the last riot that happened in the United States where Black people were targeted, their homes, businesses, and schools destroyed. But to be honest, I never learned about any of that in school, the draft riots or any of the other riots, although I will say I was lucky enough to have a history professor who reminded me that the Ku Klux Klan had chapters right here in Massachusetts. And that we should not think ourselves immune from the problems of racism, which is, again, a very easy untruth to slip into. I only learned of this much more recently, and I, as you can sort of tell, love reading, so I'm going to recommend yet another book called The Failed Promise of Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And this is where I read a lot about the ways that our country tried to heal from the Civil War, but the cracks that we also ignored and never addressed, and sometimes fall right back into. So it's really only after years of reading and learning our nation's history that I feel, I will say in my 40s, that I'm starting to have a superficial understanding of what our history is and what it means. And that has allowed me to see all of the threads from our collective woven past that our formal education truly leaves untouched. With all of that, there is one thing that I'm certain of as I speak to you today. It does us no good to ignore the past. It does us no good to pretend that there is an us and them, a good and bad, a righteous versus evil. These truths are very uncomfortable, and I'm glad that others have said this today, but I'll say it again. Learning is leaning into discomfort. Learning is leaning into discomfort, and we all have to do that. It is also very important to remember that the past actually just refers to yesterday. In doing research for today, I came across a photograph of a man named William Andrew Johnson. Mr. Johnson was a man who had been enslaved by President Andrew Johnson. The photograph was published in the Daily Mail in 1937. Mr. Johnson in the photograph was in his late 90s, but the date, 1937, struck me. 1937 is 43 years ago from 1980. 43 years separate 1980 and today. 43 years is my age. The magic of that number just sort of flowed through to me and made me think that photograph from 1937 is just as relevant and important today as it was the day it was published. And the stories that it needs to tell us are just as relevant and important today as it was then. Time does not repair all wounds. Hard work, renewed understanding, and a willingness to learn might. May we, yes, in Black History Month, but really just every single day, all 365 days of the year, recommit to learning and sharing our history so that maybe we can start to understand one another. Thank you.